They say silence speaks louder than words. I never believed that until the day I heard nothing. No warmth in her voice, no lingering glance, no absent-minded touch on my shoulder. Just silence. Lila had always been vibrant, her laughter filling every corner of our home like sunlight pouring through cracked blinds. But lately it had dimmed. At first, I chalked it up to stress, her new project at work, the long hours, the endless meetings. We were adults, after all. Life gets in the way. But then, I noticed the little things. The phone turned face down, the delayed responses, the sudden interest in going for late-night walks alone. Our bed felt colder, not because of the sheets but because of the space that grew between us. An invisible wall built brick by brick with every distant smile and dismissive nod. I told myself I was imagining things. Paranoia. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I wasn't present enough, not attentive enough. But doubt has a way of creeping in, like water seeping through hairline cracks in glass. You don't notice it at first, but eventually the pressure builds. And then it shatters. The fracture came one evening when she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. A simple mistake. A forgotten detail. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to check the weather. But a notification popped up. A message from a name I recognized. Though it wasn't anyone suspicious. Just him. A friend. Someone I'd welcomed into our home more times than I could count. The message wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. It was the way he wrote her name. Soft, familiar, threaded with something unspoken. And her reply? Short but heavy, like a whisper in the dark. I closed the laptop quietly, my hand steady, my heart not. I didn't confront her. Not yet. That would have been too easy. No, I needed to be certain. I needed to watch the cracks spread, feel the glass weaken. Only then would I decide how to break it completely. Revenge isn't born from rage. It's crafted from patience. After that night, every moment became an observation. I was no longer her husband. I was a quiet spectator, gathering evidence with the precision of a surgeon. Lila had no idea. That was the beauty of it. She laughed. She kissed me goodnight. She even asked how my day was, unaware that I was dissecting every word, every glance, every pause. I started noticing patterns. His name would slip into conversations, always casually, like an afterthought. Oh, he recommended this movie. Or he said this restaurant is great. Funny how his opinions suddenly mattered so much. Their betrayal wasn't loud. It was hidden in plain sight, masked by the routine of daily life. She'd leave for work early, claiming early meetings. I'd wait 10 minutes, then follow, never too close, always enough distance to remain invisible. The first time, she went to the office. The second time, she didn't. I watched from my car as she met him at a small cafe tucked away from the city's noise. No affection, no obvious signs, just two people having coffee. But it was in the way she leaned in, the way her eyes softened, the slight touch of her hand on his wrist when she laughed. Intimacy isn't always physical. Sometimes it's worse when it's not. I didn't confront her that day. Instead, I smiled when she got home. I asked about her meeting, listened to her lie, and kissed her forehead as if nothing was wrong. Because nothing was yet. Revenge isn't about catching them in the act. It's about letting them think they've won. Letting them build their fragile little world. Unaware that I'm standing just outside, holding the match. And when the time is right, I'll light it. Revenge isn't just an act. It's architecture. Every detail matters, the foundation, the structure, the finishing touches. You don't rush it. You draft, revise, and perfect. While Lila floated through our days wrapped in her little illusion, I was busy designing something far more intricate. I didn't want her to simply feel betrayed. I wanted her to feel hollow, empty, to lose everything she thought she controlled, piece by piece. I started with small adjustments. I changed my routines just enough to make her comfortable. I stopped asking questions, stopped noticing. The more indifferent I appeared, the more reckless she became. That's the thing about people, they mistake silence for ignorance. Her lover, David, wasn't just some stranger. He was a friend. Someone I'd shared drinks with, laughed with, trusted. That made it personal, but it also made it easier. I knew his habits, his weaknesses. He was careless in ways Lila wasn't. His pride would be his undoing. I installed a tracking app on her phone. She never noticed. I created a hidden folder on my computer, storing photos, timestamps, conversations, an archive of betrayal. But evidence wasn't enough. I needed to break them from the inside. I started planting seeds. Subtle, invisible ones. I mentioned David in passing, casually slipping his name into conversations with mutual friends. I think he's been going through something, I'd say. Seems distant lately. People talk. Rumors grow. Doubt spreads like cracks in glass. At home, I became the perfect husband again. Attentive, affectionate, present. She responded to it, guilty maybe, or just trying to keep the facade intact. But guilt is fragile. It crumbles under the right pressure. I wasn't waiting for her to confess. No, I was waiting for her to believe she'd never have to. That's when people make mistakes. That's when they fall. And Lila was going to fall hard. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary, forgettable day. That's why I chose it. Big moments hide best in the mundane. Lila had left early, claiming another client meeting. I waited an hour, then made my move. I texted David from a burner phone, a simple message that would rattle him just enough without setting off alarms. Does Mark know?
No signature. No explanation.
Just a question, sharp and loaded. I knew David well enough to predict his reaction. Paranoia. He'd spiral inward, wondering who sent it, who might be watching. And more importantly, does Mark know? By evening, the tension was already there, woven into Lila's posture when she walked through the door. She smiled, but her eyes flickered, searching mine for something. Suspicion, anger, a crack. I gave her none. How was your day? I asked, casual as ever, flipping through a book I wasn't reading. Busy, she replied too quickly. Meetings all day. I nodded, hiding the satisfaction that coiled beneath my ribs. She was lying, and for the first time it showed. Later that night, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. David. I didn't need to read the message. I already knew. But curiosity is a habit hard to break. Did you tell him? I smiled. No, Lila hadn't told me. But she would. Not today. Not tomorrow. She'd hold on to her secret, thinking she was protecting us. Or maybe just herself. But secrets rot from the inside out. I slipped the phone back, heart steady. The first tremor had hit. The foundation was starting to shift. And soon it would collapse. The beauty of manipulation is that it doesn't require force. Just a nudge here, a whisper there. People unravel themselves if you give them the space to do it. Over the next few days, I watched the cracks widen. Lila grew distracted, misplacing her keys, forgetting simple things, her mind clearly elsewhere. David was slipping too. His usual confidence faltered when we crossed paths at a mutual friend's gathering. He laughed too loudly, drank too quickly, his eyes darting to me when he thought I wasn't looking. But I was always looking. I decided it was time for another push. I sent David another message from the burner phone. You think she loves you? Or are you just convenient? Simple. Sharp. Enough to plant doubt. The next morning, Lila was unusually quiet, sipping her coffee without the usual small talk. Her phone buzzed once, twice, David, no doubt. She ignored it. That was new. Everything okay? I asked, my voice soft, concerned. She forced a smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Yeah, just tired. Liar. But I played my part well. I leaned in, kissed her temple, and whispered, I love you. She froze for a fraction of a second before mumbling it back. Not the words themselves, how she said them. Like an obligation, not a feeling. That's when I knew she was breaking. I didn't need to confront her. Not yet. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices without knowing where the pressure was coming from. Like drowning in shallow water. Panicked, gasping, but unable to understand why. I wasn't just going to expose the affair. I was going to make her wish she'd never met him. And we were only getting started. Lila began to see ghosts in the corners of her eyes. Ones I carefully placed there. Paranoia is a powerful tool when wielded with precision. I left small traces, just enough to unsettle her. A shirt of mine she'd folded was suddenly misplaced. A framed photo of us shifted slightly on the shelf. Nothing big, nothing obvious, but noticeable if you're already on edge. One evening, she came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen, pretending to scroll through my phone. When she walked in, her face pale and tight. She kissed me on the cheek, detached, mechanical, and hovered near the window, staring out as if the answers were hidden somewhere in the dark. "What's wrong?" I asked, genuine concern lacing my voice. She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "Nothing. Just rough day." I nodded slowly, then added, "You've been distant lately. Everything okay between us?" The question hit her like a slap. Not because of the words, but because it came too close to the truth she was hiding. She forced a smile, one that didn't match the fear flickering in her eyes. "Of course. Just stressed. Liar." Later that night, while she pretended to sleep beside me, I sent David another message. "She's slipping. Better watch your back." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The next day, Lila was even more restless. She dropped her coffee cup, shattered glass spilling like the metaphor it was. I helped her clean it up, my fingers brushing against hers, warm and steady while hers trembled slightly. "You okay?" I whispered softly. She nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't okay. She was unraveling, and soon there would be nothing left to hold on to. Lila's facade was slipping faster now, her perfect little world fraying at the edges. But the real satisfaction wasn't just watching her crumble. It was knowing she had no idea I was the one pulling the strings. She grew quieter with each passing day, her phone clutched like a lifeline, though she rarely answered it when I was around. David had gone radio silent, or maybe she had. Either way, the distance between them was growing, and I made sure it stayed that way. I sent David another message. "She's talking. Might want to get ahead of it." Short, sharp, enough to stir the pot. By the weekend, the tension was unbearable. For her, not me. I thrived in it. I invited David over under the guise of needing help with a project in the garage. Lila's face when she saw him standing in our doorway was priceless. A flash of panic masked by a brittle smile. "Didn't expect to see you," she said, voice tight. "Yeah, just helping Mark with something," David replied, his eyes darting to me, then back to her, the guilt almost palpable. We spent the afternoon like nothing was wrong. Laughing, drinking, pretending. But I watched them both closely. The stolen glances, the forced casualness. They were drowning in the very lies they'd built. After David left, Lila was unusually affectionate. She kissed me with more urgency, her hands lingering longer than usual, as if trying to convince herself she wasn't the villain in this story. But she was. And soon, she'd realized the story was never hers to control. I was the author. She was just a character waiting for the final chapter. The thing about guilt, it doesn't just sit quietly. It festers, it grows, and eventually it demands attention. Lila was a living testament to that now. Her eyes carried shadows, her smile stretched thin like brittle glass, ready to shatter with the slightest pressure. I decided it was time to apply that pressure. One evening, over dinner, I casually mentioned David. "You know, he seemed off the other day, like something's bothering him." I watched her reaction closely. She froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a casual shrug. "Maybe just work stress. He's been busy, right?" "Yeah," I replied, swirling my glass of wine. "Funny how people can hide things, isn't it? You think you know someone, but there's always something beneath the surface." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her fork. Perfect. Later that night, as she pretended to sleep, I picked up her phone from the nightstand. No passcode change. She was too distracted for that. Their conversation was sparse now, laced with tension. David's last message read, "We need to talk. I think he knows." I chuckled softly, placing the phone back without a trace. The next day, I left a note for her on the kitchen counter, just a simple sentence written in neat, controlled handwriting. We all have secrets. Some just hide them better.
No signature. No explanation.
When I came home that evening, she was sitting at the table, the note crumpled tightly in her fist, her face pale and drawn. She didn't mention it. Neither did I, because silence speaks louder than words, and hers was deafening. Lila's silence had become louder than any confession. She was unraveling, thread by thread, trying to keep her world intact, but the walls were closing in. I watched her from across the room as she stared at nothing, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She'd lost weight, small, subtle changes only someone like me would notice. The hollowness beneath her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands. She was breaking, and I wasn't done yet. I planned my next move carefully. A simple trick. One that didn't require technology or confrontation. Just human nature. I left my phone unattended on the kitchen counter one morning. The screen conveniently unlocked. A message preview visible. I think she suspects I know. No name attached. Just enough to bait her curiosity. I knew she'd look. She couldn't help it. When I returned, the phone was exactly where I left it, but the subtle shift in her demeanor told me everything. She was too quiet, too careful, like someone trying not to disturb the thin ice beneath their feet. That night, she initiated a conversation, her voice trembling slightly under the weight of forced casualness. "Are you okay? You've been distant lately." I smiled gently, feigning surprise. "Me? No, I'm fine. Just work stuff." She nodded, her eyes searching mine for answers she was too afraid to ask. The beauty of it all was that I never had to accuse her. She was doing the work for me, drowning in her own guilt and fear. But I wasn't here for a confession. I was here for the collapse. And we were almost there. Lila was now a shadow of the woman she once was. Anxious, fragile. Her mind spiraling into places she couldn't control. She'd become trapped in the invisible maze I designed, every turn leading her deeper into paranoia. But the final act was approaching, and I needed her to reach the edge. One evening, I suggested we have dinner with David. Her face tightened for just a heartbeat, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Sure," she said, her voice slightly strained. "That'd be nice." The dinner was a masterpiece of tension. We met at a cozy restaurant, the kind of place where laughter should feel natural, but not that night. David was restless, his confidence eroded. He avoided my gaze, focusing on his drink more than the conversation. Lila, on the other hand, overcompensated, laughing too hard at nothing, complimenting dishes she barely touched. I kept the conversation casual, slipping in little remarks like poison wrapped in sugar. "So, David," I said, sipping my wine, "you've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" He forced a laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, just, work's been hectic." "Funny," I replied softly. "Lila's been the same. Must be something in the air." I watched them both. Lila's fingers tightening around her glass, David's jaw clenching slightly. When dinner ended, we said our goodbyes. But instead of driving straight home, I took a detour. We parked by a quiet overlook, the city lights flickering below us. Lila stared out the window, her reflection fractured in the glass. I broke the silence. "You know, it's strange how people think they can hide things forever." She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes glossy with unspoken words. But I didn't want her to speak. Not yet. Instead, I reached over, gently brushing her cheek, my smile warm and hollow. "Don't worry," I whispered. "I always find the truth." And with that, I started the car, leaving her drowning in thoughts too dark to escape. The real game was just beginning. The days that followed were the quietest yet. But it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that roared beneath the surface, heavy with everything left unsaid. Lila was unraveling faster now. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, pretending it was just a bad dream. She'd jump when her phone buzzed, glancing at me like she expected me to ask questions I never did. But I didn't need answers. I already had them. One evening, I decided to set the final piece in motion. I left an envelope on our bedroom dresser. Plain, unmarked, impossible to ignore. Inside were photographs. Not explicit but damning enough. Images of Lila and David together. A hand lingering too long. A gaze held with too much meaning. Each photo was a carefully chosen fragment of their betrayal. I knew she'd find it. And she did. I was downstairs when I heard the sharp gasp, followed by the creak of floorboards as she stumbled back, clutching the envelope like it burned her fingers. She came down moments later, her face a mask of panic and guilt. "Mark," she began, her voice shaky. "I can explain." I held up my hand, silencing her. "No need." She stared at me, wide-eyed, waiting for anger, for rage. But there was none. Just calm indifference. "That's the thing about secrets," I continued softly. "They don't stay hidden. Not when someone's paying attention." She collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling as she gripped the edges. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. I nodded thoughtfully. "Of course not. People rarely do." Then I stood, leaning in just enough to let her feel the weight of my words. "But meaning doesn't matter now, because this is where your story ends." And I walked away, leaving her drowning in the silence she had created. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Lila didn't sleep that night. I could hear her restless movements, the soft creak of the mattress, the occasional stifled sob. But I didn't comfort her. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours. The next morning, she tried to pretend everything was normal, making coffee, humming softly like she used to. But her voice trembled, and her hands weren't steady. She finally spoke, her words fragile. "Can we talk?" I looked up from my cup, tilting my head slightly. "About what?" Her lip quivered. "About us." There was no us anymore. Not the version she remembered. That us died the moment she decided to betray me. But I played along. "Sure," I replied, leaning back, watching her squirm. She stumbled through an apology, her words hollow, rehearsed. She blamed stress, mistakes, confusion. Everything but the truth, that she'd wanted more, and she thought she'd found it in someone else. When she finished, tears streaming down her face, I simply smiled. "Thanks for being honest," I said quietly. Relief flickered in her eyes, the kind that fools people into thinking forgiveness is on the horizon. But forgiveness was never part of my plan. Later that day, while she was out, probably meeting David, trying to untangle the mess, I set the final stage. I sent David a message from Lila's phone. "Meet me at our place. We need to talk." I knew he'd come. His arrogance wouldn't let him ignore it. When Lila returned, I was waiting, calm and collected. She noticed the packed bag by the door, her face paling instantly. "Are you leaving?" she whispered. I shook my head slowly.
No.
"You are." Confusion twisted her features, but before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Perfect timing. She opened it to find David standing there, his expression tense, unsure. And that's when I dropped the final thread. "I thought it was time you both had a proper conversation," I said softly, stepping aside, letting them face each other. Then I closed the door behind me. But I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I had one last move to make. I didn't go far. Just to the garage, where the thin walls allowed every word to seep through like water through cracks. Inside, their voices clashed, frantic, hushed at first, then louder, more desperate. I imagined the scene unfolding. Lila confronting David, her fear battling with her guilt, while he tried to hold onto the fragments of their shattered illusion. But they weren't alone. Hidden beneath the living room table, planted days before, was my final touch. A small recording device capturing every word, every confession, every desperate plea. I let them tear into each other for nearly an hour. Accusations flew like shards of broken glass. "You said he'd never find out." Lila's voice cracked under the weight of her own lies. David's reply was bitter, sharp. "You're the one who couldn't keep it together. I told you this would happen." It was music, a symphony of betrayal, composed by their own hands. When the silence finally settled, I returned. I opened the door slowly, my presence freezing them mid-breath. Their faces were pale, haunted. Lila's eyes were swollen from tears. David's jaw clenched, his bravado long gone. I held up a small flash drive, dangling it between my fingers like bait. I thought you'd want to hear how you both sound when the masks fall off. Lila's mouth opened, but no words came. David took a step forward, his face twisting with some pathetic attempt at defiance. I smiled, that same calm smile. This isn't about rage, I said softly. Rage is fleeting, but humiliation, that lingers. I placed the flash drive on the table and walked past them, heading to the door. Oh, and one more thing, I added, pausing with my hand on the doorknob. I've already sent a copy to everyone who matters in your lives. Your boss, your friends, even your families. Their gasps filled the room as I stepped out, closing the door gently behind me.
No screaming.
No violence. Just the echo of everything they'd tried to bury. And that was the cruelest revenge of all. I didn't look back as I walked away. There was no need. The damage was done, woven into every thread of their lives now. Days passed, and the ripple effect began. I heard from mutual friends, whispers wrapped in disbelief, rumors spreading like wildfire. Lila's carefully curated image crumbled overnight. Her colleagues grew distant. Her friends avoided her calls. Her family's disappointment carved deeper wounds than any words I could have spoken. David didn't fare any better. His professional life unraveled swiftly, opportunities slipping through his fingers like sand. His charm, once his greatest asset, was now overshadowed by the stain of his betrayal. But the real victory wasn't just in their ruined reputations. It was in knowing they couldn't escape the truth. No matter where they went, no matter who they met, that shadow would follow them. A permanent scar etched into their histories. Lila tried to reach out. Messages filled my phone. Apologies, explanations, desperate pleas for forgiveness. I read each one, not out of sentiment, but curiosity. How many different ways could a person say, "I'm sorry," when what they really meant was, "I'm sorry I got caught"? I never replied. Eventually, the messages stopped. But her silence was louder than her words ever were. One afternoon, weeks later, I passed her by chance on the street. She didn't see me at first, her head low, shoulders hunched under the invisible weight she now carried. When our eyes finally met, there was no anger in hers, just emptiness. I gave her a small nod, not of recognition but farewell, because she was already gone, and I had nothing left to say. Time has a way of dulling sharp edges, but not all wounds heal the same. Some linger beneath the surface, invisible to the world but impossible to forget. I moved on, or at least I pretended to. A new apartment, new routines, even new faces. But the echoes remained, quiet whispers woven into the fabric of my days. Not grief, not regret, just echoes. Sometimes, I'd catch myself thinking about her. Not the betrayal, but the in-between moments. The quiet mornings, the shared glances, the laughter we once thought was real. It's strange how memories work. They don't disappear. They just lose their warmth. I never heard from David again. His name occasionally popped up in conversations, usually followed by words like disgraced or ruined. I felt nothing.
No satisfaction, no bitterness.
Just emptiness where rage used to be. As for Lila, I heard she tried to start over in another city. New job, new people, new lies, probably. But I knew the truth would follow her like a shadow. That's the thing about betrayal. It stains deeper than any scar. One evening, I found the flash drive, the one with their recorded confessions, their fragile voices tangled in guilt and desperation. I stared at it for a long time, thumb brushing over its cold surface. Then I threw it into the fireplace, not out of forgiveness, but because I didn't need it anymore. The real punishment wasn't in the evidence. It was in the knowing, the silent, inescapable truth that lived inside them both. As the flames swallowed the last piece of my carefully crafted revenge, I realized something. I had won. But victories like this don't come with parades. They come with echoes, and sometimes that's enough.